Hello, and welcome back to an episode of The Fifth Seat. Today we have some lively topics for you, and we can't wait to get started. So with that being said, do you want to, I guess what I want to say is we have a very special guest later on, Bob Dutko, who'll be joining us. He is a nationwide radio personality who is a Christian apologetic, and he's going to be an exciting treat for us to have on the show and the topics that we have. But with that being said, we will hear from him a little bit later, but you want to take it away with our first topic?
Yes, so we're first going to be talking about a lot of the riots, not the protests, but the riots. And it's important to make that distinction because there have been millions of people marching who've been peaceful and fine. However, we're discussing specifically the riots. And we saw what transpired with Kyle Rittenhouse and Jay Daniels, and how there's so much going on with those things. It's like the riots were permitted to happen. And I always said the picture of 2020 was the CNN correspondent who had a helmet on and a large fire behind him, saying mostly fiery, but mostly peaceful protests. Like, it was just absolutely ridiculous. There is a large fire behind you. You're gaslighting me. Yeah. You know, so that is a problem that we're seeing a lot of these riots turn to where now people are being murdered. So with the Kyle Rittenhouse case, from the way it looks to me, it appears that he was shot at first, because there's video clips of him talking well before the incident saying, I have a medic bag and I'm here to help people and stuff. Now, should a 17-year-old been driven across state lines to protect other people's property? No, I think that was a bad idea.
You forgot the part where he was heavily armed with an AR-15.
Well, I didn't forget that part. I'm not.
Illegally so. He's a minor.
For one, I said he shouldn't have been there.
Right.
So
I agree
even before we get to the gun part, right, he shouldn't have been there. And of course, him having a weapon, I think that was crazy. However, in a situation when his life is in danger and someone attacks him first, that doesn't mean he loses the right to defend himself. And that's kind of the thing. What do you guys think?
I want to start with Judy.
Go ahead, Judy.
No, high school principal, I want to hear from you.
Yes, let's hear it.
I don't think a 17-year-old should even have access to a gun like that. Mm-hmm. I don't think parents should be allowing their kids to go across state lines, for any kind of a reason. But I doubt whether his parents knew about it. As far as him carrying a gun, I don't know whether it's legal to have a 17-year-old.
Well, if you're underage, you're not.
You're not.
You're not permitted to have a gun.
Really? In my area, the kids go out hunting all the time.
Oh, that's different.
It is?
I mean, you're not going into a city to supposedly patrol other people's property.
Okay.
So
I guess I just don't know the
you want to go hunting on your own property. I think that's.
Okay. All right.
Did you have anything else, though, or are those kind of your main thoughts?
I'll think of more later.
Well, because I'm likewise curious, because you're also a high school teacher. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, because this is somebody who could have been your student.
Yes. I think that what Christina was saying earlier about the difference between the protests and the riots, I think that we've got, if you will, bad actors on either side, at either ends of the spectrum. People who are destroying property and taking the opportunity that's been opened because of civil protest in the streets to say all the rules, like none of the rules apply. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know the particulars of the video, but he went there to be a tough guy. Mm-hmm. And so I find it hard to believe that he was, acted upon first, because he showed up flexing and wanting to prove a point.
Can I ask you, what do you mean by that? Because you said you didn't see the video. Are you saying simply because he had an automatic firearm with him, that was him flexing or whatever words?
Yeah.
So just simply having that gun where people could see it was using bravado is in your mind?
Yes, and yes.
Do you know anything about the Lowell police chief who was fired this summer? You know anything about the Grand Rapids riots?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it was right after the Detroit riots. Anyway, Grand Rapids had I want to say it was like June 2nd, we had, I'm from the general area, and we had terrible, stuff happening, and businesses being destroyed, and business owners like rushing down there to stop people from destroying their livelihood and everything. And so within a couple of days, and it had been discovered that Antifa was involved in that, organization, what was happening. And so there had been some rumors, whether they were going to be true or not. There was some rumors that were flying that both the police communities as well as the average communities were hearing that Antifa was going to target the city of Lowell next. And so, and a couple of other cities Lowell's not too far from Grand Rapids. And so these 3 or 4 teenage boys actually went to the city of Lowell one day on June 2nd. They went to the city of Lowell and they called the police chief. They said, hey, we're going to be exercising our Second Amendment rights. We're just going to walk up and down the main street of Lowell, so that if a bus of people wants to come to our community and think that they're going to start trashing businesses or harassing people that live here or anything like that, we're going to exercise our Second Amendment rights to defend our community. Our small police force, we know you cannot handle this kind of thing on your own. I mean, even the Grand Rapids police force couldn't handle the riots on their own. So anyway, so with that being said, that police officer ended up telling the community about it and ended up saying, this is, he did a tweet or a Facebook post. These boys are going to be here. This is what they're doing. Just so you know, you don't have to call 911 and flood our system. We want to have that line open for emergencies. And so they're exercising their Second Amendment rights. And he ended it with, the Lowell Police Department supports the Second Amendment and the legally armed citizen. He ended up getting, 2 days later, he was forced to resign because of that very sentence. And they made him take that one sentence off the post first, and then they still fired him. They forced him to resign. So I'm actually representing him. It's going to be an interesting situation. But the reason why I bring that up is because some people, and in fact, most of the negative comments, there were thousands, most of the negative comments were actually not from people within the city. But on that Facebook post, people were commenting because these boys were carrying these firearms, presumably the same age as the people that we're talking about, that they were somehow asking for a fight. But when in reality, all they were doing is saying, you're not going to bring your fight here. We're going to stop this. We're not going to stand by and take it.
So, Katherine, do you think it's better for individuals with weapons to go up and protect property, or do you think that maybe the police force should have called another police force for assistance?
Regardless of what I think would be the prudent or wise thing to do, our Second Amendment applies to all, and they had a Second Amendment right to bear arms, and all they were doing in that scenario, they were not brandishing, they were not, there's this concept, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but it kind of goes in and ties into what you were saying, that merely having a firearm like that appears scary, or it appears like I'm trying to threaten you.
Bearing arms is different than your Fourth Amendment right to defend your property, right? And so most of these people are going, like for example, Kyle Rittenhouse, he went across, again, state lines, was a minor in possession of an AR-15, and he believed that he was going to defend the property of somebody else.
You're focusing on property. I don't think it's at all, no, it's not about property here.
It is.
Yeah, no, but you're taking it about the Fourth Amendment. Nobody said the Fourth Amendment but you. Really, in exercising your Second Amendment right, the whole point is that they're trying to go, whether it's property, like we saw in Grand Rapids, or whether it's people. You actually mentioned it earlier today in some other segment, I think, or maybe it was a couple weeks ago. At any rate, you mentioned that the concept that we have people that are, you've seen people being physically assaulted, essentially, in some of these situations. Now, I'm not saying this is all the left in their protests are like this, because we see it on both sides, absolutely. But when you have people that can see, whether it's the right or the left, that are coming to town, and what they did to the last community was physically harm people and destroy businesses, we have a Second Amendment right to secure our neighborhood, our community, our friends, our people that we know. We have the right to defend ourselves, our families, and our communities. And I'm not saying that the police shouldn't be involved. In fact, these boys talked to the police and let them know what they were there to do.
We're talking about Kyle Rittenhouse and Jay Danielson.
And he has the Second Amendment right.
I don't even know the case that you're talking about.
He has a Second Amendment right. They have a Second Amendment right. It doesn't matter.
Christina,
Second Amendment right.
I was just going to say the whole thing with the riots permitting gave way to the kind of situation with Kyle Rittenhouse, because even from the footage I saw, when the person shot at him first, he didn't even have his weapon drawn. You know, so the people attacked him first. So again, whether or not
Who didn't have his weapon drawn?
Kyle Rittenhouse,
It's
not
a-
until
it's-
later.
he's carrying a rifle.
He's carrying it, but it's not drawn.
It's drawn.
No,
You
his
have
weapon
a
is
rifle.
down. No,
It's
he didn't.
drawn.
No.
It's
Well,
not a- there's
maybe-
not a holster.
Okay, well, no, you can't put an
He's
AR-15
not really a
in
fan
a
of the Second
holster.
Amendment. That's okay.
The AR-15, you can't have a holster for it. But
That's
his weapon
exactly
was
the
down.
point. So therefore, there's no some
his
concept
weapon was
of
down.
drawn.
The
Well,
weapon
let's
was
hear what
down.
her thought is on this.
But the weapon is down, so therefore he's not posing a threat to anybody. I mean, I went to the they had the Operation Gridlock. There were guys walking around with the
He just
AR-15.
never
They
should have
had it
been there
down.
in the first. He's a
Yeah,
kid.
okay, right. But see, that doesn't mean that he didn't have a right to defend himself. Those are two separate issues. One issue is
I'm
he
not
shouldn't have
arguing
been there.
that.
He shouldn't have been there. But then the second case is he had a right to defend himself. But what about the other case in Portland with Jay Danielson? Now, that's a whole different case because from the footage I saw before they shot him, they said we have a Trumper and bang. So
Right.
clearly that was a targeted move.
Different.
And I don't believe he was armed, was he?
No.
I'd like to, Judy, you want to chime in? on that?
Yes, being my experience with young boys, they either watch TV or something, but they want to help. They want to go in and be the big boys and help. So I think that's what's happening with that situation and the one you're talking about in Lowell. They just want to be the protectors. They're trying to be a man.
I agree with it.
Do you?
Of course we want to. We want to protect. That's our role.
Okay.
Now, as far as the Jay Danielson in Portland, I think there's a lot more than meets the eye there, right? So, what's been reported is that there was this Trump supporter who was more or less assassinated, right? And assassinated by a supposed Black Lives Matter supporter. In fact, the guy that killed him, Michael Reinl, had a black fist tattooed on his neck. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody who does that sort of thing, right? Now, when he was interviewed afterwards, you know, he was labeled as Antifa and that sort of thing. When he was interviewed, he recorded a video, a friend recorded a video of him afterwards in which he said on camera that he was a military contractor and that he, quote, had no choice. I had no choice, he said. And he said that twice. And then he followed that up by saying they were going to kill my black friend. Now, there is a video of Michael Reinl shooting Jay Danielson. And on that video, two things happened. One, there was no black friend associated with Michael Reinl. The guy was lying in wait. He planned on killing this guy. It was an organized hit. There were multiple people involved in it. And they took this guy down, right? And now, what I find interesting about this is his recording afterwards. The fact that this was an organized hit, and he was told, and he said that he had no choice. He says he's a military contractor, and then and how all that adds up. The fact that okay, let's arraign the guy, let's arrest him. But what actually happened? Trump. I don't know if it was President Trump or not, but someone sent in the U.S. Marshals. And they killed the guy. They assassinated him. So now we have the assassin of the assassin taken out. Right? This happened before. It happened with JFK. It happened with RFK. Right? It wasn't assassination under RFK, but it was a hypnotizing thing. And so basically, but we do know that the president has obstructed and potentially destroyed evidence. He's obstructed the evidence related to his tax returns this entire time.
That has
So are you
nothing to do with the
trying
topic
to-
at
I'm just
hand.
saying, what I'm
thing in
the
Portland?
connection that I'm drawing here is the destruction of evidence. Michael Reinl was assassinated because he assassinated Jay Danielson. I'm saying that there is a big time cover up going on and that it's not what you think it is.
But it has nothing to do with President Trump, though, so I don't think it's fair to bring
I'm
him
not
in.
saying, I'm not equating that. I don't know who gave the order for the U.S. Marshals to go in and kill Michael Reinl. But the U.S. Marshals killed Michael Reinl, and because the U.S. Marshals killed him, instead of arresting the guy, we don't know what actually happened there. And we'll never know.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely sounds fishy. I'm not going to negate that there, but I don't want to equate President Trump with any of that because there's so many people, even though he's the president, there's so many players and actors involved at the federal level. We can't
I don't know
pin
who
that on
said
him.
it, but the U.S. Marshals killed him.
Yeah, well, and I'm not negating
That's
that.
all
I'm
I'm
not.
saying.
Yeah, so the thing too about it is that I feel like a lot of these governors and mayors and whatnot, they permitted this stuff to happen, and that's how we had these situations like with Kyle Rittenhouse.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have happened if they wouldn't have permitted the rioting. That would, because you open the door, and I know that's going to sound a little crazy and off topic, but I think of Colombia, because Colombia had an issue with a Marxist uprising. And then after the Marxist uprising, and you started having these Marxist groups attacking people, you had the rise of paramilitary groups who would come to respond. So craziness is going to beget more craziness. So it's the job of the police, that's why we pay our taxes, in order to keep the community safe. Because when communities are burned down, it's just not property destroyed, there's livelihoods, there's all types of parts of a person's life. You bring poverty, which brings more crime, which brings more death, which brings down health, wealth, everything. So this is such a big problem, and it is a very much orchestrated effort. I totally believe it, like even with the chop zone in Seattle. Like, how was that able to go on as long as it did? I have a hard time believing that was just a spontaneous thing.
So I'd like to make one more point, and I agree with you on this, right? So let's talk about why people are protesting in the first place, right? So people are out there in the streets because people are losing their lives, and we're not able to prosecute the police. That's because of something called qualified immunity, which means that if somebody who works for the government violates your rights and they weren't prosecuted or they're let off the hook on it before, that means that they're going to get let off the hook on it again.
That's not what that means. But actually, here in the state of Michigan, just for what it's worth, I actually agree that qualified immunity, any immunity really for government officials who are intentionally violating the constitutional rights of others or any aspects of our Constitution, should be held criminally and civilly responsible. So just to be clear, what we could do, I have the Restore Freedom Initiative that I drafted, a constitutional amendment petition to modify the Michigan Constitution, and specifically immunity is gone in that sense. If you are intentionally violating the Constitution, you will be criminally and civilly responsible. It's a misdemeanor the first time, it's a felony the second time.
Unless
no
that person is related somehow to the federal government.
Nope,
yes,
not at all.
Yes, and here's why.
That's not a conspiracy theory coming?
It's not a conspiracy theory, it's fact. And here's what happened. In 1945, after World War II, it was Truman that passed the National Security Act that organized the intelligence apparatus. In 1947, the CIA Act was passed. What the CIA Act allowed was for the basic lack of unaccountability. The CIA, under the CIA Act, does not have to report their activities to Congress. There is no supervision. And the CIA has the ability to go and raise their own funds and to recruit personnel. And there's no recourse. So if the CIA, if there are, let's say, state level officials who also have ties to the CIA, then that individual, and we don't even know who that person is, has immunity under federal law because of the CIA Act of 1947. Now, what I'd like to do, what I'm arguing,
not for state crimes.
You know, there's jurisdictional overlap in that case.
No.
And it would go to court.
Guess what? I would be the constitutional attorney fighting it to the end.
You would fight that, but it would definitely go to court because the feds and the states would definitely be arguing about who has jurisdiction on that.
Feds wouldn't take that fight to the public.
That's fine. Listen, I don't want to argue that. The bottom line is that would end up in court, and people would be arguing because we're arguing about it right now. The solution to this, and this is where I'd like to get your feedback on this. Christina, we were talking earlier about whether or not you could see better in the light or in the dark, right? And we both agreed that it's easier to see during the daytime because that's what we're built for, right? When the CIA Act grants the intelligence community classification so that of their activities, and then classification of activities in general are extended to pretty much the entire government, so much to the point that the American people no longer know what's happening behind closed doors in Congress and on Capitol Hill and everything else. Is there anything wrong with transparency? I mean, isn't that the right answer?
No, that's why I'm telling you I'm fixing it at the state level, and you're just dismissing it like it's not going to be a thing.
I'm not dismissing. I'm saying we need to have transparency at all levels.
We do. We absolutely do.
We do. I agree with you guys on that. Transparency is always essential because, again, the government works for us. They don't own us.
Right.
However, I think the concern, too, is we wanted to touch on is the Marxist element in the Black Lives Matter protest. And I think it shouldn't be written off that the founder of the organization, who is collecting millions of dollars, where we have no idea where it's coming from or what it's going to, said that they are Marxist. And then in a lot of their protests, they bring in other issues that have absolutely nothing to do with police brutality. They're bringing up capitalism.
The rights of the gay and lesbian communities.
Right,
so
because
let
me finish.
Yep.
Because the whole thing too, like on their website, they want to get rid of cisgender normativity. I mean, what does this have to do with police brutality?
Nothing.
What does disrupting the nuclear family have to do with police brutality?
Exactly.
So that's the ultimate problem. Nobody has a problem with people protesting against citizens being tyranny. No one has a problem with citizens being shot or attacked by police officers, no question. But when you have an organization who is hijacking a legitimate concern to push their own agenda, that's the problem. And they're using it to justify rioting, because I've seen one on Fox, one of the head of the New York Black Lives Matter said, if we don't get what we want, we're gonna tear the system down, and you could take that literal or figurative. That's what he said on national television.
Which is a threat.
Right, so the leader of their group is calling for violence. Also in Chicago, they were justifying looting, say people are looting to take care of their needs. No, they are
That's
not.
exactly, in fact, I personally had a conversation with Black Lives Matter members when I was there at the Capitol in Lansing for, I think it was a Second Amendment rally that we were having. And Black Lives Matter was there. And I thought, you know what, I want to take this opportunity, quite frankly, to tell them about my amendment, because the main thrust of the whole legitimate part of the argument is that we need to hold government officials accountable, whether it's, you know, some of the systemic stuff that that was shared with me that day about just different things in civil government or local governments and things like that, whether it's the bigger picture that we're seeing with, you know, shootings and fatalities and things like that at the hand of police officers unnecessarily, right? So anyway, I wanted to talk to them about that. And what the conversation ended up turning into was talking about riots and talking about the situation in Minnesota, where I spent 10 years of my life, and how these individuals that I was talking to were justifying like going into Target stores, breaking the stores and going in and taking whatever you want, breaking the glass and taking whatever you want, because that's okay, because, well, we have needs to meet and the whole system is racist and we can't meet our needs, so we have the right to do this. And I'm like, you don't have the right to do that to anybody. So
She's probably repeating the narrative that she saw on television. And
well, no, but they genuinely believe that.
Well, but here's the argument.
They genuinely believe that. They believe that when you believe, see, the way they paint this narrative is that America is a systemically racist country, and white supremacy is causing the death of black people. Therefore, we are fighting for our very lives, and in war, nothing is off the table. So therefore, we're justified as shooting, looting, whatever we want to do.
They can do that, but nobody else can.
That. They totally believe that, because that is part of the whole Marxist agenda. That's not conspiracy theory. The Marxist agenda is a real threat.
Okay, so that's fine. First off, the only way to hold government officials accountable is to end qualified immunity.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so the second thing I'd like to ask then is, do you believe that I'm being told we got to wrap this up then. One question. Who benefits by promoting people that are talking about violence and things like that? Does that benefit the movement for equality under the law? No. Exactly not. So that means, from my perspective, I would say that someone's paying these people and promoting them, right? And it's not the people that want the equality under the law.
No, but I think people that want the change are being manipulated.
That's what the people need to keep in mind at home, is that the people that are out there marching like me and other people that want equality under the law, and you notice that I ask everybody for whether or not they support the Constitution and equal rights for all people, we're not out there rioting. The people that are rioting are being manipulated to do so, and we don't know who's doing that, because there's classification, because we don't own our own money, because the CIA and our intelligence apparatus are exempt from transparency. If we really want to fix the societal problems, we need to get transparency in government, we need to own our own money, and we need to be able to trust what's happening, and the only way to do that is with objectivity.
But we also need to hold the criminals criminally responsible,
Absolutely.
whether they're in government or whether they're rioting on the streets
Absolutely.
and breaking into Target
But
stores.
that goes into the whole thing about the district attorneys, and I know we got to close, but that goes into the whole thing with the district attorneys, because there are people the district attorneys who were put in office with George Soros' money are letting these rioters out. And that is why I always say it is a Marxist agenda. That's my opinion. However, we have to go.
I want to say, to close qualified immunity, to get that to happen, you have to repeal the CIA Act of 47.
Okay.
That's the way to do it.
So
but that brings
now
us
we
to
have to move on, and it's time for our QWERTY Quips. Okay, everybody, so now it's time for our QWERTY Quips. The one I have is actually something from the AP, and they tweeted, "The close ties of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, with the conservative religious group People of Praise are drawing scrutiny. The group views men as divinely ordained as the head of the family." Now, not to get back into our topic about gender roles, however, why should a person's religious beliefs be seen as a threat? And oftentimes I feel like Christians are looked at as though we are over-exaggerating, that there is this a bias and this kind of bigoted attitude towards Christians serving in the public square, like we saw with Bernie Sanders and Russell Vought, when he like grilled him down about the exclusivity of Christ and that belief, and saying that people who hold that view shouldn't serve in government. So how big of a threat is this to our liberty?
I guess to me, and you have a very valid point, and I think I agree exactly with where you're going. But as you said it, it made me actually think more of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In the early 90s, when she was being brought on board, the conservatives at the time were actually more concerned about her ability to transition from an advocate, a zealous advocate for all kinds of women's rights and other kinds of issues, and then how she could transition from working at the ACLU, of all organizations, and other involvements, to a justice who is supposed to be neutral as to a particular person or organization. And so to me, I'm thinking, well, in the end, they ended up seeing that, she was able to, I disagree that she was able to be neutral, but regardless, they ended up voting to approve of her, approve of that nomination. So to me, that goes to that. It's who she was. We're all people. I'll just say it's kind of analogous to this. I serve as a mediator. I have for many, many years. And in one of my roles, I was actually accused in one of my reviews a few years back of, well, you have personal views. You have personal, Christian and political views that you feel very strongly about. So I don't think you can neutrally represent our organization as a third-party neutral. And I said, who are you kidding? Every single person on this planet has views, and they have a view on religion, or they have a view on politics, and most of us feel very strongly about our views. However, those of us who serve in any kind of neutral capacity, we're the ones that are able to recognize where our own viewpoints start and end, and how to serve as a neutral then, and experience and understand other people's viewpoints, and how, in that context, how it goes into the, goes through the mesh of the Constitution. I mean, that's the framework from which every single decision that a United States Supreme Court justice should make, their decisions upon. So anyway, that's kind of like my thought on that is, regardless of what her personal beliefs are on that, we're all entitled to our own beliefs. And so is she able to serve as a neutral justice who has her own beliefs, but still provides that constitutional framework for any dispute that comes her way? That should be the question, period.
I think it's very difficult for people to look at themselves and say, I hold a view and I'm objective, and I'm able to be objective, but that other person over there is radical, right? Sort of, it's like it's this split. We can't oftentimes, concede to other people what we feel we can, come off ourselves. So I think that happens again and again and again. And so, I think you're right that her background, she would have to transition, but we have the faith of other people like Justice Ginsburg or Justice Kavanaugh to be able to say this person moved from this prior role to this other unique role of presiding and listening and weighing. But when people are afraid, they want to look at the other side and say, but you're rabid radical, or something like, it's really hard to.
I don't understand your views, therefore I'm afraid of them, and it must be wrong.
Yeah.
Bob, what do you think?
Well, frankly, I believe that whenever I hear people say that somehow Christians don't have a sense of objectivity and that they're not able to offer their opinions on something because they're so narrow and everything, and it's somehow going to cloud their views, it makes my eye twitch, because it's just flat out not true. We all have different worldviews. We have things that we happen to disagree with each other on. Okay, I happen to be a born-again believer in Christ. I'm not going to be shy about that. But that doesn't mean that I don't have the ability to have an objective opinion and view things honestly and go wherever the facts lead. And I would argue in any kind of discussion, we got to get past this notion that somehow if you're a Christian or if you're a conservative, if you're whatever, then somehow that limits your scope, that limits your view, and now you're not able to do your job. We're hearing this about Amy Coney Barrett, for example, and a lot of the attacks on her. Well, she can't be an objective jurist because she's going to be tainted in her views. That's absolute nonsense. You could apply that principle to anybody with a worldview about anything. Unless you're a pet rock, you have views that other people could claim are going to taint them. So if she or anybody else has shown an ability and a willingness to apply their job according to the confines that they're required to, in this case the Constitution, then I think it's time for Christians, conservatives, and others to stand up and say, you know what, enough is enough. We want to be judged by the same standard that everybody else is judged by.
Absolutely.
But is this really about whether or not she's Christian, or is this really about the fear that she may rule against abortion? 'Cause
I think that's a lot of it, honestly. And I know this is, I'm going to sound like a partisan hack, but I'm just going to say it. I think a lot of left-wing people don't like the idea of somebody who is potentially conservative. They want their way. They want Roe v. Wade to stay the law of the land no matter what. Okay, they want the Heller.
I assume you don't, right? Is that,
I do not. I'd like Roe v. Wade to go away.
Personally, the good news is, well, from your perspective, it's gone. It went away in '92. But I'd like to talk about.
I would strictly on the Roe v. Wade position. Okay, I think abortion is abhorrent. I think it is murder, and I think abortion ought to be illegal, plain and simple. So get rid of Roe v. Wade completely, send it back to the states. Then I'd like to see another case go up through the ranks that acknowledges the personhood and constitutional right to life of unborn human beings as well, so that abortion is rendered illegal in this country, just like slavery, thankfully, was excuse me, at one time rendered illegal. So we did away with that evil. At one time in our history, we grew up and matured beyond that sick policy that we held on to. It's time for us to grow up and mature beyond abortion.
I just have to say real quick before we move on, is just the one thing that I agree with you that Roe v. Wade and the implications of that, and murder is murder, and it is from day one of that life, absolutely. Only the courts should never be in a position to make law.
They legislate.
So there should not be any decision of the court, any
Agreed.
court opinion that we look to as law, as case law. It should be actual legislation that, whether it's a state or federal issue, that the legislators that we put into place to make laws, they're the ones making that law. So I just wanted to make that point for
And by the way, it's a point of big frustration for me that unfortunately the judiciary in this country has usurped power that I don't believe that they have, quite frankly.
Exactly.
Our framers intended for, of the three equal and separate branches of government, if there was anything that carried deference of more weight, it was the people, which is the legislative. I would argue the legislation has dropped the ball and just handed power over to the courts in a way that they should not.
And the executive branch.
Yeah.
And I say the executive branch has done that too, yes, I agree.
All right, folks, so we need to move on to our second QWERTY quip.
I'm up, right? Okay.
Yep.
Here we go. All right, so this is a tweet from Fair and Equal Michigan. This is an organization that is collecting signatures in order to pass legislation in the state of Michigan to make discrimination against people on the basis of sexual orientation illegal. So this is what they say. It is truly heartwarming to see so many supporting this cause. Even if you are not personally affected by this discrimination, choosing to support a future of inclusivity rather than one of exclusivity shows the moral fiber that this nation was founded upon.
Kurt, your thoughts on that?
I think that it's terrible that people are discriminated against and are hiding, and I would like to see that go away.
I think sometimes discrimination is a good thing. Now, I know that sounds bad, but let me explain. Right now in California, their governor just signed a law. They're going to put people in prison based on gender identity, and it's self-identified gender identity. So that means that biological men are going to be allowed to go into women's prisons as long as they identify as women. That is crazy. So I think that sometimes, of course, if you want to be a teacher, a doctor, whatever business, or you want to live somewhere, I agree. No one should ever be discriminated against. However, they are extending this ideology into places where it's grossly inappropriate.
Schools,
like we
prisons.
have boys in female athletics, and it makes me want to just scream
Locker
and yell
rooms.
on the highest level. And you had Jerry Nadler, who I think is a clown, and I'm saying that mildly, is going to say that there's no evidence that there are real differences between men and women in terms of athletics. That is ludicrous. The reason why we have sex-segregated sports is because we know men are stronger or faster. They got denser bones, fast twitch muscles, more lung capacity, more hemoglobin in their blood. So I mean, it's just
So what's
so
your
much.
argument? Like,
My
what's your
argument is that sometimes it is important to discriminate. It depends on the case. Discrimination isn't a dirty word. Like, I may discriminate against, I like one thing over another. It just depends on what's the basis of the discrimination.
Well, and something that's very important to recognize is I notice how it's been, and I'm not saying this to pick on you, because I think media has characterized that organization as doing this legislation, getting these signatures so that they are protecting sexual orientation, I think was the one that you talked about. But gender identity, gender expression, sexual expression is also included in there. So just to be clear, because if you actually go to their website and you follow the links from them, they're actually an organization that's also fighting for the rights of pedophiles. Love is love no matter what the age.
organization is this?
Fair and Equal Michigan. Pedophilia is something where it's love is love, regardless of the age. That it's about time that we stop, discriminating based on age and children. Whatever. It's disgusting, and it goes into a lot of detail. And also, it has that gender identity piece, which the sports thing is one thing, okay. But I have 4 kids. I have 3 daughters, and I have 1 son. And I remember in Michigan when my oldest was in 9th grade, and that whole gender identity thing was coming out, and it's going to be okay. So this in the high schools, if we have this gender identity policy, then you can have this male, maybe an 18-year-old male who's a high school senior who is self-identifying as a female, gets to go into the women's locker room where my 14-year-old daughter is going to be changing. That's not okay. I don't care if that particular student wants to have separate accommodations because they don't feel safe because of some other, the transitioning piece or whatever. I can be okay with that. But when in that scenario, all the pieces that were in play there are saying, well, if my child didn't feel comfortable, then my child had to be the one that was segregated into their own little bathroom stall somewhere else across from campus. They can't go into the women's locker room to be with other girls. And the same thing happened with Planet Fitness and the woman in Midland, and how she ended up in a federal lawsuit about that because she said, I don't feel safe with a male in the women's locker room with me. And they said, well, you can no longer be a member here, and they kicked her out. So those are things that, whether, especially in prison and in school, they're not choices. Our children don't have the choice, or the prisoners don't have the choice about whether they're going to be in a certain room or at a certain time or doing those things. So if we're going to have all those kinds of things, if this was just an issue of whether you're gay or not, and you don't want to be discriminated against because of that, I can back. I mean, I don't personally agree with that lifestyle, but I can back the ability to have that freedom to do that. However, we included in that legislation, on that petition, far more things if you look at the actual language of the petition, which is why I'm saying look at that website, because the website explains why that language is in there.
And also, I think as a Christian too, there's some concern there when you're thinking about like theology schools, because I remember Elizabeth Warren, when she was in the primary, saying that Christian schools were bigoted. It's like this: if you don't want to adhere to the principles of the Christian faith, that's fine, but you can't expect to work at a Christian institution that's explicitly for the purpose of spreading the gospel. That's like me going to an Islamic school and says, oh, I rebuke the Shahada. Like, that's crazy. And then say, oh, why don't you want to hire me? I mean, it's just ludicrous.
Because they have the right to that religious.
Exactly. So there is a lot of gray area.
A lot of gray area. Absolutely.
There's a couple of points that come to mind as I was hearing you talk. First of all, and you're absolutely right in what you're saying, we got to remember also the psychological damage that's done to girls because of this LGBT, especially the transgenderism movement. Because that 13, 14-year-old girl that's in the locker room or the shower, okay, this is something, she's now being traumatized by a man who walks into there, that, let's face it, if he sent a picture of himself in a text message, he would be arrested. But now suddenly she's able to see this with her eyes, and she can't undo those images. 14, 15-year-old girls ought not to be seeing those kinds of things. It's psychologically and emotionally damaging for them, and it doesn't just stop there. Look at homeless shelters, for example. When the liberal left tries to force homeless shelters to go transgender, a lot of women in homeless shelters are women that are escaping sexual assault and sexual abuse and domestic violence. And now they have to share sleeping quarters with a man because the man says that he identifies as a woman. Okay. This isn't about hatred for people. This isn't about anything like that. But we need to
respecting the rights of others.
Exactly. We need to think about the harm that this causes to people, the consequences of these kind of policies. That matters. And by the way, when you were talking about churches and Christians, I know this is going to sound like hyperbole, okay, but mark my words, if we don't change the trend here, it's not just going to be Christian-owned businesses like Jack Phillips and the baker in Colorado and the Christian photographer that's being forced to participate in gay weddings. I'm telling you, the LGBT movement, if they are left unchained, will go into churches and start saying, we demand that you perform this gay and lesbian wedding, and we say you don't have a religious exemption, and if you refuse, then we're going to slash and burn financially you, and I would argue a lot of them are going to risk losing their tax exempt status. I see that in the next few years.
I don't think that's a reasonable expectation.
I think that's
I can see where that could be a fear, and I can see how, based on other case law, that could be a potential extension of it.
Yeah.
But there's no constitutional basis for it. I mean, the church has already received all sorts of exemptions to be able to cater to their community as they see fit. And not only that, but the gay and lesbian community wants to be served by a community who wants to serve them. Right?
But that's not what happened with the baker.
That's not what they do.
But
that's not what they do. They go into the Christian baker. They don't go down the street. They specifically target the Christian baker.
Money is green, and green needs to be available for all people. That's different than going to church.
Well, no, but the Fuller Seminary is having an issue right now, and I can speak to this because I just finished theology school. When you sign up for theology school, you have to adhere to a statement of faith. And this woman who was a lesbian, they told her that she had to go. And the thing about it is, like, well, that's mean, but when you sign up for a theology school, you have to adhere, and you're signing on that I agree to the statement of faith. And if you want to advocate for something that's outside of the statement of faith, you have to go. And she's suing them right now. So
but she should be going. Discrimination.
Discrimination.
But the thing is,
again, that's my example of if I went to an Islamic school, a Jewish school, a Buddhist school, it does. If I, as a religious institution, when I sign up for their institution and I say I agree to your statement of faith, I can't turn around and say, well, I don't want to do this anymore, and you have to accept me as I am, and they say, well, no, okay, well, I'm gonna sue you.
Well, and
so that's what we're talking about.
But the same thing around. Let's say there was some sort of school that was based on the premise of homosexual families or something like that, and then I wanted to go there, and I'm like, I'm heterosexual. I totally don't believe in anything that the homosexual community wants to further, but I have to sign a statement that says that I do, and then, well, wait, you want to kick me out? No, I'm going to sue you? No, that's wrong. It's not that it's picking on the person who's trying to cause the problem in there. It's a two-way street. The shoe works the same on the other foot. I think that everybody should have the same rights, and you don't get to go into somebody else's store and demand that they perform some sort of service for you. Now, if they were going to outright say, I'm not going to bake you a cake, okay, that's one thing. But when you have a company that says, or a person that says, I will bake you a cake, I'm not going to decorate with a husband and husband or a wife and a wife, I will decorate the cake and you can go and decorate it how you see fit, that's okay, but that was not good enough for them. Or if you have a photographer that's supposed to be capturing the images of the husband and wife and how they, they're starting their life together, that's getting into the personal, intimate nature of the beginning of their marriage. And if a photographer says, no, I'm Christian, I can't do that, they shouldn't be forced to do that. That's not how it works. So yes, money should be able to talk, and people should not be able to force other people to participate in those things. Now, I will say that it's not an overall thing, right? Because when we saw, like in the 50s and the 60s, and there was, well, I'm just not going to serve you at all because, because you're a black person or because you're a female or because whatever the situation is, those kinds of things are not good. But I don't know. Judy, what are your thoughts?
I think that it shouldn't be a law. The photographer should be able to say, I don't want to do your pictures, and not be penalized in any way, shape, or form. That's his own business.
Yeah, no Muslim baker believes that he should be, or no Muslim caterer believes he should be forced to cater a pig roast. Okay.
Right.
No atheist who owns a website should be forced to have to create a JesusChristIsLord.com website. Okay. You have to have the right to say that violates the principles.
Sure.
Nobody believes that Mothers Against Drunk Driving should have to hire and produce and put on an event for alcoholics.
Right.
Okay. So there's a common sense issue here where we need to be able to say the Christian business owner, yes, of course, if you come in and patronize my business, I'm going to serve you. But if you ask me to use my skills and talents to create and design something for an event that violates my beliefs, it's absurd to say that I'm not allowed to do that, or therefore I'm discriminating against gay people. I'm happy to have all the gay customers in the world, but I'm not going to use my skills and talents for an event that violates my beliefs. I think most people understand
for
that.
goods and services, but the
Sure,
concept
absolutely.
is the free exchange.
Absolutely. And by the way, there's no Christian business owners out there that are saying to gay people, hey, you're coming in here with a boyfriend or wearing a rainbow shirt, I'm not going to serve you coffee at the counter.
And if they if they did do that, I mean, because there's evil people everywhere.
And it would be wrong.
It would be wrong, and they should be held responsible for that. But that is not the issue that are being brought brought before the
right.
courts, and that's not the issues that they're trying to address in things like that petition, and that's what is upsetting. So
Okay, so I think we're moving on to talk about the riots and BLM and all that jazz.
So we talked about it a little bit earlier, but we didn't have the pleasure of having our special guest here with us today. So what are your thoughts? You heard us talking about BLM and Antifa and the individuals that, we had the young man who was charged with murder in one state, and another younger man who was lost his life over in Portland, Oregon. You know, what are your thoughts on those things?
Well, the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, it's unfortunate that it's become such a volatile issue that people can't even talk about this anymore without getting so angry and upset. And I think we need to in America have the freedom to say, I do not support the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement, and not have that automatically assumed to be, well, then you must be a racist who don't care about black people being discriminated against, and you deny that racism exists, okay? That's not true. Does racism exist? Of course it does. We live in a fallen world. We're going to continue to see racist idiots pop up. Nobody's denying that. But the Black Lives Matter movement, I would argue, is really a misnomer, and here's why. First of all, the Black Lives Matter movement, yes, it is Marxist, okay? Look at the people who founded this organization. It is absolutely Marxist. They have a liberal, leftist, Marxist, anti-American agenda that they push, that they use under the guise and banner of Black Lives Matter. And I know this is really political, but I'm just going to say it. The NAACP is not really about advancing African Americans, okay? They're about advancing a liberal agenda. If they were about African Americans, they would celebrate people like Clarence Thomas. National Organization of Women is not really about advancing women, or they'd be celebrating people like Amy Coney Barrett, okay? They're about leftist agenda. The very same thing with Black Lives Matter movement. This is a liberal, left-wing, Marxist, anti-American movement. If they really cared about black lives, then they wouldn't ignore the 99.9% of black lives that are not on their radar screens. For example, they don't care about the thousands and thousands of black lives that are lost in black-on-black crime in cities like Chicago and others, in these neighborhoods being torn down. When Antifa comes to town and starts burning down buildings and putting people out of work and dragging people out of their cars and beating them, the overwhelming majority of people that are being hurt through these riots are people of color, African Americans. But they don't matter. And of course, Black Lives Matter doesn't care about school choice and voucher programs, which benefit African Americans more than anybody else. They certainly don't care about abortion, which targets little black babies more than anybody else in this country. So, and they certainly don't care about black police officers who are killed in the line of duty. And on top of that, the only thing that they really care about is take all of the black lives that are lost and hurt in this country for all kind of reasons, let's ignore them, and let's only laser focus on if you have a white cop and an unarmed black person. In that isolated scenario, those are the only lives that matter. The other 99.9% don't. And so I consider the whole movement one big misnomer. Now throw it out on the table.
I want to chime in on this. Bob, do you agree that everyone deserves equal rights on the Constitution?
Of course.
Okay, so if we can agree on that, and that's something that seems like everyone agrees with, right? Mm-hmm. Do you also, well, I'm not going to get into it. I can tell you that what's up on the Black Lives Matter website that was created by 3 people has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on what people are marching for. I was out there marching. Right, and no one told me to get out there marching. There were millions of people out there marching. These 3 women who created this website did not tell us to get out there marching.
But it's the 3 women. We're not telling people to riot and burn things and stuff either. And it's those people that are causing the problem.
Okay, yes, but there's no centralized organization. That is a myth. There's no organization to this. This is all decentralized, spontaneous protesting on behalf of Black people count too is effectively the message. And where you live in America where black families are, 17 times more, black men are 17 times more likely to go to prison because they're black than white men.
Okay, but in all fairness, those statistics have been skewed in a large way, okay? Because first of all, we hear so much about, let's be fair. My feeling is, let's not look at this emotionally, let's look at this factually and logically, okay? What we hear is 25% we hear 13.5% of the population is black, but they make up 25% of the police shootings.
Yeah,
okay? That's what we hear, but here's the other side of the statistic that we don't hear. The overwhelming majority of police shootings that happen in high crime neighborhoods that are 75 to 85% black. The communities are 75 to 80% black, but only represent 25% of the people that are actually shot by police. And I would remind you, there is racism. There are racist cops. Nobody's denying it. Nobody's defending what happened to George Floyd.
The point that I wanted to make is that you were basically saying that this concept of this group of Antifa and Black Lives Matter is some centralized organization. It's not.
That's
hold
not
on.
That's not the primary argument. That's not my primary argument.
Just because two things are concurrent, doesn't mean that they're congruent. Doesn't mean that they necessarily intersect. And the thing about it is, Black Lives Matter is Marxism in blackface. And as I referenced in the book earlier, Color, Communism, and Common Sense, Manning Johnson talked about how the issues that black people were dealing with were being hijacked to push communism. I mean, that's been going on forever. And he pointed to the NAACP because they said the only issues that you can care about are racism. It's like black lives only matter if white hands take them.
Right.
And that's the reality of it all, because when you look at abortion clinics like you mentioned, Black people in Michigan make up 14% of the population, but yet account for 50% of all abortions. So if we're accounting for that much of the abortions and accounting in America for 50% of all homicide victims, it's like we're being exterminated. But we can only talk about that in the context of the 9 people who died at the hands of police officers. So in reality, it's not about Black lives, because if I truly care about you, I'm going to care about the thing that's hurting you the most. And those things are being ignored by these groups. And they only want to march when they want to say that America is evil, America is racist, America is terrible. And I don't agree with any of that. No nation is perfect. But that doesn't mean that our country is a terrible place. And so I think their movement is absolutely terrible. And they throw in capitalism, and then they're taking in millions of dollars. So to say they're decentralized is not true.
Taking in money? What
Black Lives Matter organization.
We actually went through this, remember, in our segment just a minute ago. So I guess at this time, we probably should say goodbye to our viewers. Obviously, this is a very heated topic in this room, but also all across America. So with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of The Fifth Seat, and we'll see you in our next episode.